the classic liberal take on universal belonging. He says, there is no such thing as a man. There's no such thing as a woman. There's no such thing as, I think he says, a Jew. There is only such a thing as a Christian. Now, there's two ways to look at this. First, we can say, oh, well, great. This is the multiculturally universalizing emancipatory gesture. Mm-hmm. There is no such thing as sex. Sex is as gender. Gender is a social construct, etc. Right? It's sort of, we can project that onto St. Paul. But what's important here is the end part that seemingly short circuits the exchange. He's not saying there's no such thing as a man and a woman. There's no such thing as XXX. There's only humankind. Mm-hmm. Instead, he's saying there's only Christian. Now, in a sense, you could say, well, does that mean that if you're not a Christian, you're not considered a human? Which would be the reactionary underpinning of St. Paul, as we pointed out before. And here we can see again how the universalizing of human life is very close to the universalizing of human death. You are not even considered human as such. But think about it in a little bit more of a favorable light as well. It's positing that within the Christian faith, the only difference that matters, the fundamental feature of human life as such, is the difference between Christian and non-Christian as such. Not in a reactionary sense, but let's take a step back. One of the ways in which Christians often congratulate themselves is by saying that they're so much more enlightened than Jewish people because anybody can be a Christian. This is a common thing that, like, it's surprisingly common, at least in the circles I've been in, where people say something like, well, at least us Christians aren't such an exclusive sect of privileged. It's like anti-Semitism in a liberal form, which is to say Jewish people are excluding. They're not welcoming. They don't include people within Judaism.
They're not proselytizing. They're not out trying to convert people. They're not... Yes.
Exactly. Whereas only Christians have the true grace of allowing anybody into their church, into their faith.
The entrepreneurial spirit of...
Yeah. Now, of course, this is a very favorable way to interpret Christianity from within, because secretly what it also means is precisely the fact that Christians don't respect anybody. Anybody is a potential Christian. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. Your concrete universal substance doesn't matter because you are either a Christian or you are someone who is not yet Christian. And you could argue that it's only within the Jewish faith that there is the fundamental gesture of respect, which is to say, our religion may not be for you. In fact, we're not claiming that our religion is the only access to the universal experience of what it means to be alive. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, these are all kind of cynical takes on this problem, but what we're really talking about is the problem within the idea of a universal substance as such. How do we experience the idea of universality? And there's a fundamental deadlock that exists within the experience of the universal itself, which is that the only way that we have access to the idea of universality to begin with is through its seeming opposite. In other words, through human, subjective, individual, rational experience. Mm-hmm. And so we're back at the problem that Kant posits within Kantian transcendentalism, which is the idea that essence can only be contemplated by reason, which means that reason is itself the barrier to essence. In other words, essence cannot be thought by your mind, which means that the mind, rather than being the tool to assess essence, the mind is itself the barrier. And this is what I've called the Kantian cop-out. The Kantian cop-out is to say, I can't truly conceptualize the truth, essence, external reality, but I know it's there. In fact, I know it's there because I can't think it. That is the Kantian cop-out. As we've already posited in the previous classes, Hegel's turn towards speculative idealism is to make the properly teleological move, by which rather than positing an a priori essence from which subjective reason is a deviation, a fall, a barrier, instead, the idea of the universal substance of essence only emerges retroactively through the fall itself. Very technical, but we'll give you some more examples so that hopefully it continues to make sense, I think. Okay, so that's St. Paul's position, which you could call the liberal humanist Christian position. Levi-Strauss is fighting the conservative position. And how is Levi-Strauss fighting I also want to point out, Paul is not advocating the liberal humanist position. He is critiquing it, but we'll get to that. Levi-Strauss is fighting the conservative position of the universal. When Levi-Strauss goes into anthropology, when he starts doing field work, the predominant model for anthropology, and this may surprise you, is the idea that if we study societies, we can find a universal essence of humanity, like a universal grammar of human existence that will unlock the secrets of the best possible life. It's a weirdly Platonic republic idea, which is that if only we can ascertain the good, or the most harmonious, virtuous form of life, the ideal representation of the good, as it were, then we can replicate that like a blueprint for our own society.
Well, and I think that we get an extension of that actually in modern studies of nutrition.
Yeah.
This kind of romanticization of if only we could go back to our indigenous diets and eat like hunter-gatherers, then we would be tapping into our primeval, you know, immortal self, healthiest self. I mean, this is the appeal of
Exactly.
diets you've probably heard of.
I mean, literally what you're saying is like what I was thinking, and I love when we're saying, because of course, like the first thing that comes to mind of this like imitative process where we take the best from societies is the whole idea of what is it, like the blue diet or the blue island?
Blue wave, but I was thinking even like paleo is literally...
I mean, the blue wave diet is the idea that like, why do some people live longer? How could we live longer too? And we've decided nutrition is it. And yeah, paleo is...
But I love the idea that it's like nutrition and diet studies is the extension of anthropology. This idea that if only we could find the original purest form of living, and now that we've decided that society is irrevocably broken, perhaps we can at least fix our foods, because it goes from being a social problem to an individual problem, or the perception of the shift from social to individual.
So that's really good. Yeah, that's a really good point. The project originally starts as how can we become the most virtuous society by learning about other virtuous societies. Now it becomes how can I create a bubble of individual, I don't know, excellence above all others. Of course, the reason the keto diet, I'm not saying keto diet only appeals to conservatives, but the conservative principle within the keto diet is precisely positing this imaginary past, which can be preserved and replicated for your own benefit. Now, as far as I know it, there's different strains of ketoism. One of them has the vulgar reductionist biological argument, which is that during the period in which keto was the norm, human beings evolved fastest. And supposedly you will evolve faster if you eat this way. The second way, of course, of doing it is to simply suggest that there was a time in which eating was simpler, in which you weren't subject to the industry, etc. Of course, there are reasons that people consume a keto diet for health purposes, for I don't know, inflammatory diseases, immuno things. I'm not trying to suggest that keto is bad necessarily, because I know I'll get like waves and waves of keto people attacking me otherwise. The point here is that, I mean, I didn't want to make it about keto. The point here is that when Levi-Strauss went to the tribes, did field work, the central paradigm within anthropology was still that if we only looked closely enough, we could find the universal truth about humanity, and we could all become equal. We could all live our best and highest life. You can probably understand that Levi-Strauss, someone says we're confusing paleo and keto. That's true. Yeah, we mean paleo. Yeah. This is one of those things where you go to a Star Wars convention and you say, I love Star Trek, like just to make people really mad. This is exactly why I don't want to talk about diets, because like,
we're not thinking about diets.
I don't want to trigger this part of the internet.
We just recovered from Christmas dinner. We're still in recovery.
Yeah, it is paleo. Yeah. Whatever. Stay in my lane. And so Levi-Strauss, of course, doesn't believe that there is such a thing as a universal substance, an essence of humanity that the anthropologist could somehow tap into and then export to everybody else. Of course, to believe that already makes the fundamental attribution of error, or error of attribution, which is that you are somehow the privileged subjective observer who can assess what the core of any other society is and then somehow bring that back to you. Of course, in a weird way, the more honest sense of that is in the 60s and 70s when it becomes commercialized. We're going to export the idea of, you know, this eternal substance of like the idea that people in India are more tapped into nature or something, right? So that spiritualism is always a reactionary fantasy for people in the West. Of course, Levi-Strauss realizes this. He says, the very idea that there is a universal truth buried within native society that we have lost and that we can somehow have access to says more about us than it says about them. And Levi-Strauss says something even more radical. He says, there is no way that we can learn the truth about another society, A, because that truth doesn't exist, and B, because the only truth we can learn is that there is no truth to society. The secret of every society is that there is no secret underneath. That every powerful room with powerful people, at the end of the day, is a room with people sitting around the table. There is no underlying legitimization that makes that society pure. In a weird way, every society is an accident that has to be constantly retroactively legitimized. There's a reason why we celebrate Thanksgiving every year, and it's not just to be grateful. It's to tell ourselves that this is okay, that we are allowed to be here. You know what I mean? I don't want to make it about Thanksgiving either, but there we go. So Levi-Strauss essentially posits that there is no secret to society. In fact, that the only secret is that there is no secret. There's no deeper meaning behind socio-cultural practice, something which is being obscured that the anthropologist can find if, like an archaeologist, he digs deep enough into the cultural consciousness.
Yeah, there's no pure form society.
Yeah.
There's no ideal, perfect model.
No essence as
No
such.
essence,
There's no
yeah.
universal layer of society that can be accessed through subjective position. Instead, Levi-Strauss argues, and this is what makes him a structuralist, is that the only thing that exists is difference or antagonism. In other words, the only thing that a society is what a society is not. A society understands itself first and foremost by saying we are not X. And that happens both on the external level. A German is not a Dutch person, but also within your society. I am not like that person. I am not like that person. I have, like we distinguish ourselves.
Yeah, and to get back to, I mean, if I can, or make it about political conservatism, one of the most important unifying claims of modern conservatives in the United States is to be anti-tax, which is, I mean, that runs from George Bush Sr. to, there's a whole organization that conservative representatives and senators adhere to, which is the vow not to raise taxes. So it's more, so rather than being for something, the group identity and definition is designated as being against taxes.
I mean, taxes, I don't want to spend too much time on it,
Yeah.
but taxes is an interesting discussion because, especially in the United States, the idea of individual sovereignty is very much enshrined into the public national consciousness. And so what it means to be quote unquote American is to be a free-thinking, free-speaking, no tax-paying, gun-toting American. Now, I don't mean that like just as a farce. It's one of the short circuits that is almost, I would say, unique to the American experience, which is that a very intense idea of patriotism and nationhood is combined and articulated as the ultimate expression of individual identity. Of course, those things can't be reconciled. And when you realize that those two levels of the universal and the particular have been made to like overlap in a tautological fashion, you start understanding so much of the political energy that emerges out of this deadlock.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
no, that's absolutely true. Yeah.
But the point for Levi-Strauss here is that Levi-Strauss says that society functions in a way that is analogous to language. Because language, as we've pointed out before, Hegel has said this, Nietzsche says this, as soon as you open your mouth, you're doomed. Language is the process of signification. Language is the process of always trying to say what you haven't said yet. You are going to be misinterpreted as soon as you open your mouth. Worse yet, as soon as you open your mouth, you've already misinterpreted yourself. Of course, if you think that there is something a priori that you wanted to say, you've already posited the fundamental ideological mistake, which is that there is such a thing as an essence or a true form in my head, rather than the idea that everything I say, everything I am, is simply a constant process of trying to catch up with everything that I am not. In other words, that to be is to be refracted through the other. To speak is to communicate and be interpreted or misinterpreted by the other. To be in a society is to be specifically surrounded by others all the time. And one of the ironies is that a lot of liberals today criticize, and they criticize, for example, American society as being too tribalist. Oh, we're all too tribal. But the irony is that this is, again, the false universal of the liberal positing. Oh, we need to go to the universal substance, the human being, the radical humanist level. And so what is posited as the enemy is tribalism. And at that exact point, you can see how the conservative worldview and the liberal worldview are two sides of the same coin. The conservative posits that there is a universal a priori of society that is threatened by an external enemy. The liberal posits that there is an external universal substance of humanity that is threatened by particular belonging, the nation, ethnicity, religion, tribalism. But they're the same argument, just from the opposite side of the coin, because both of them make the fundamental philosophical ideological error of thinking that there is an essence or a truth that is a priori. That is what they have in common. And that's why if we go back to the study about conservatives versus, versus liberals, and conservatives are happier than liberals, we all know that secretly leftists are the happiest. Leftists are the truly happy ones, because leftists see that both the liberal and conservative position posit false universals, and that the only universal is the internal barrier, the blind spot within those liberal conservative worldviews, which is precisely the fact that antagonism, that social conflict, that the irreducibility of the universal substance of society itself is the truth of society. What Marxists would later call the part of no part, what Lacan would call the real of society, what Adorno would call the definition of society being the fact that we can't decide what a society is. Once you realize that the truth of society, the secret of society, is that there is no secret behind it, that's where happiness comes from. That's where liberation and emancipation comes from, because that's when you know that, strictly speaking, it can be changed. Yes. That there is a nothingness there that is being counted as something, and that if you are able to fight a war of hegemony, you're able to re-articulate what that thing is that you call society. And that what we call society is, of course, fundamentally flexible. I'm going too fast here, so I want to...
No, I think that's all really good. And I think that that's part of the challenge when talking about how to teach history. The problem isn't to say, oh, your ancestors should be blamed for all of the problems of, racial intolerance and religious, segregation and conflict, etc. But rather to say, this is the history, but it's not necessarily your personal history. It is the history of the people who came before you, and they've shaped the society that you live in. But you are not personally responsible for it. You are personally responsible for what comes next. And you can only shape what comes next if you see the contingency of history, if you see the accidents in history, rather than, trying to find the pure form or get back to the ideal form of what your society is.
I mean, strictly speaking, history doesn't exist. History is not what happened. History is what you say has happened.
Yes.
And that doesn't mean that history is like a fake or that it's like didn't really exist. The very idea of history is the process by which the past becomes subsumed into the ideological framework of the present, by which you can then imagine the future. And so what you're trying to get at, I think, is that the way in which you understand your own history and the history of others is strictly related to the way in which you can anticipate your future. Right. Of course, the irony of that whole process within existential philosophy is that what you experience as the present is a vanishing mediator between the past being posited as set in stone and the future being posited as pure potential. And so in a sense, you're stuck. You're stuck in the present. The present isn't really there. The present is either being subsumed into the past or is being posited as on hold for the future. Right? Anyway, so what I want to get at here, because we're trying to build a bigger argument about metaphysics and about the idea of essence, is essentially that both Claude Lévi-Strauss and St. Paul have an awareness of the fact that there's a false universal when we either posit a universal human condition, which is what St. Paul does, or when we posit the idea of a universal human societal substance, which is what Lévi-Strauss is fighting. Now, St. Paul, even though it may look like the fact that he's arguing that we're all just humans, the end of the sequence is specifically, we are all just Christians. Now, in a radical Paulinian sense, what he's saying by Christians is precisely we are not humans. There's something very subversive about the Paulinian idea that everyone is a Christian, which is to say everyone is not human. Now, this isn't just to say everyone belongs to the faith of Christianity. It's specifically that St. Paul is essentially arguing that the difference between Christian and non-Christian is Christianity itself. Now, the reactionary take on that would be to say that if you're not a Christian, you're an enemy. If you're not a Christian, you're an infidel, etc., right? That's sort of the typical cynical atheist take on it. But there's something much more profound that happens here, which is that Christian is supposed to be the short circuit in the sequence, the signifying sequence of signification. In other words, within the signifying chain of particular belonging, man, woman, Jewish, ethnic, racial, whatever, Christian is supposed to be not the thing that signifies everything, not the master signifier, but instead the not signifiable substance, the irreducible element within the sequence itself. Now, what is the difference here? The difference is that if you posit humanism, as an a priori universal, then all of the particular belongings are a fall from that universal. You start with a blob, which is human, and to be a man and to be a woman, etc., is to be a particular derivative of that substance. The Christian faith actually posits the exact fundamental opposite, which is that you don't have a universal humanity to begin with from which particular belongings are a subset, because that would be reactionary. That's a liberal idea that then, well, if we get rid of all the particular subsets, if we just get rid of man and woman and Jew and whatever, then we will become the pure form of humanity. That's freaking dangerous. Christianity doesn't start with that a priori human substance. Instead, you start with particular belongings, and it is only through the subsuming of those particular belongings that you reach the idea of Christian universalism. In other words, strictly speaking, the universal posited within the Christian faith, or within the Paulinian doctrine, is specifically that essence comes after appearance. That essence emerges in the fall from appearance. That appearance is not a fall from essence. That essence is retroactively generated through the fall itself. Now, of course, you can understand that St. Paul is the one who radicalizes the idea of the crucifixion.
Right.
St. Paul simply takes the teleological move of the crucifixion and transposes it onto human morality. Now, let's briefly talk about what that is. The idea of the crucifixion, Christ on the cross, is specifically the short-circuiting of a signifying change, a chain of culpability. In other words, what is sacrifice? Sacrifice is the end of exchange value. This is also the idea of turning the other cheek. When you turn the other cheek, it's supposed to say we're no longer exchanging blows. It stops here. And ironically, that's a much more violent gesture, because you're not just returning a blow, you're actually ending the blows by saying, I will no longer blow back. This is also why sacrifice is so important within the idea of the Christian faith. Sacrifice isn't just a selfless act. Sacrifice is like the ultimate assertion of human agency and subjectivity. The irony, of course, is that it's precisely liberal humanist atheists who are afraid of that radical content, which is why there's an entire industry of books that is supposed to historicize Christ or Jesus. For example, by saying, one of them says that, well, when the cheek was turned, actually within Judean society, in that tribe, turning a cheek was actually similar to giving somebody the finger. So actually, when Jesus is supposed to turn the cheek, he's actually saying, fuck you. No, that is ideology par excellence. That is saying we cannot deal with the properly fundamental radical act of saying, I refuse to engage in this exchange of abuse. Instead, it reinfers abuse into the idea of non-abuse, which is, of course, what neutralizes the act. The liberal the liberal instinct to want to historicize turning the cheek into a socio-political gesture of bad faith actually neutralizes the act. Anyway, the point about... am I going too fast here?
No,
Yeah?
I kind of want to go back to your insight about Paul's point into saying we can take all of the particulars and create a universal rather than return to a universal. Because I think that you're really right to emphasize how radical that is. Because I know you've talked in previous classes about how sort of the trajectory of Christianity was to reject these sort of rules given, but also there is no secret, there is no mystery of Christianity. It is the Christianity that is discovered. It is the Christian community that creates itself.
Sure, I can try to summarize it very briefly. It's also in my book. There's like there's like a chapter of this in my book, which you can find on Patreon.
That's why it's so familiar.
Plug.
But yeah, no, I think it's really radical because what it absolutely... No. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, let me just do it very quickly.
Yeah.
The crucifixion, the event within Christianity. When Christ appears, the Judean coalition between priests and politicians says, if you are the Son of God, prove it to us. Of course, that is within the logic of the Judean society, which is there is an eternal essence substance. And if you are a representative of the absolute, prove to us that you are the particular embodiment of the absolute. It is only through the crucifixion that Christ refuses to prove, cannot prove. In fact, the moment in which Christ himself disavows the idea of the eternal Father. Father, why have you forsaken me? Strictly speaking, within like a Chestertonian framework, this is the moment in which God stops believing in himself. And so what happens in the crucifixion isn't that Christ dies. It's that the idea of an eternal substance, of a godlike deity that is external to reality, dies. What dies on the cross, says Hegel, is the idea of an absolute God himself. Instead, the idea of an a priori universal essence, God, is transposed back into the particular subset of humanity itself. Now, the only way to get there is to go through the Paulinian doctrine. Paul is the one who realizes the radical ontological shift that has taken place, where we've gone from a world in which there is an eternal godlike substance that has to be emulated through particular faith. In other words, the Jewish faith is simply the process by which you wait for the Messiah to come. It's like setting an elaborate dinner table, hoping that the Messiah will show up. Whereas the Christian faith is, nobody came for dinner, and you've eaten everything at the dinner table, and now you have to do the dishes. That's the process. It's a teleological swap, where now essence no longer hides behind appearance. Essence has been transposed back into appearance itself. The reason that Christ cannot be allowed to exist is that Christ is the unfolding, the vanishing mediator of this short circuit, of this parallax shift, by which the absolute is transposed back into the subject, the particular itself. And so what Paul points out, within the very idea of there is no such thing as a particular human being, there is only Christian, is specifically that Christian is the name of a human being who has been freed from the previously existing teleological order, which was a hierarchy with man beneath God. And that to be Christian is precisely to realize that the particular substance of being in the world is the predicate onto which the eternal godlike substance then emerges after the fact.
Yeah.
And from a philosophical perspective, that's one of the most radical shifts within the entire history of human thought.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I know it's a big idea, but
no,
I'm
it's a big idea. No, you fit it in. You fit it in beautifully because it is truly radical. And I think that part of the reason that we do go back so often to theology as a tool to explore philosophy is because there are a lot of radical insights that aren't necessarily grasped in the atheist tradition.
Yeah.
In modern times.
It's also the most fundamental undermining of Platonic metaphysics.
Yes.
And also why Platonic metaphysics are inherently conservative in that sense. Can you tell me what time it is? Because we've lost...
yes. It is...
9:03. Okay, so we should stop in just a moment, I think, or so.
Yeah.
Okay, so when we started this class, I said I wanted to talk about the difference between concrete universality and abstract universality. Now, one of the things that you have to understand about Hegelian speculative idealism is that Hegel fundamentally undermines the idea of concrete versus abstract. Usually, the idea was that there's a universal substance of reality, godlike essence, what Plato calls the pure ideal form. Yeah?
I'm
Do you
with
feel
you.
rushed? Okay,
No, no.
yeah. Which is the idea of an abstract universality. Why is it abstract? Because we can't think it. We can't conceive of it. Kant says that human reason is not the tool to reach essence. It's actually the barrier. Because we try to think essence, we cannot know it. Hegel is the one who undermines this. Because for Kant, the idea is that concrete universality, in other words, your belonging in the world, your particular frame through which you experience life, for me as a man or as a religious person or whatever, that is a barrier to essence. In other words, that the concrete universal is a barrier to abstract universal. Hegel says it's exact other way around. There is no a priori universal substance which is abstract. Instead, it only emerges through concrete essence. The mistake that so many liberal interpreters of Hegel have made is to say that that Hegel is a humanist. That Hegel is saying, don't you see, the universal is actually in here. That if we all connect our hearts and our minds and our souls, we'll all be happy and we'll find the absolute and human belonging will subsist. No, on the contrary. The whole point for Hegel, especially the younger Hegel, before he becomes like the state conservative Hegel, is exactly the Paulinian idea, which is that you start with concrete particular belongings, and it's only through realizing the truth, which is that there is no concrete particular belonging except the refraction through the other, that you emerge with the idea of essence. And that doesn't mean that essence is an illusion, but it means that essence appears only through the process of going through illusion. In other words, that being human isn't a fall from grace. That grace emerges only through the fall, which we call human life. In other words, that the fall comes before the thing itself. It's also why Hegel is a Christian thinker. Within the Christian logic, and I mean that in a very literal sense, a logic as in like a structural system of metaphysics, there is the idea that grace isn't the fall from God. That grace is how God emerges within the fall itself. And once you realize that the most radical political gesture of early Christianity is precisely that it undermines the Judean hierarchy of order in which the priests are the emissaries of the higher substance and the people have to abide by the priests, you realize that the revolutionary core of Christianity was to say, let's get rid of the umbrella and let's put the umbrella at the very bottom. In other words, the part of no part, the excluded part. And so the Hegelian Paulinian, and Paul talks about this in the dialectic of law, he doesn't call it a dialectic, but it's law, is that it's not just that every rule has an exception. It's that the rule exists only in the exception. In the same way that for Marx, the working class is the truth of society. In the same way that for Lacan, the Lacanian real tells the truth about the fetishistic disavowal of treating appearance as if it were hiding essence. Again, this will make more sense if you read my book. That process by which the binary between abstract universal and concrete universal is itself subverted, by which the concrete universal becomes the only way in which abstract universality is posited, is a profoundly liberating philosophical gesture, because it allows the true emergence of subjectivity as such. Now, of course, where we will be going in this lecture series is to show that what we are now doing has its own ideological mistake, which is that we're thinking that there is such a thing as a subject that is a full subject. Lacan, the French psychoanalyst Lacan, of course, understands perfectly that subjectivity is itself the ultimate vanishing mediator. In other words, that subjectivity, the barred subject, is what emerges. And for Hegel, Pace Lacan, Pace Zizek, the whole idea is that what resolves the supposed deadlock between abstract universality and concrete universality is precisely the issue of subjectivity. The fact that you can only understand the idea of the universal through subjective experience. That's where we're heading next week. So for now, thank you guys so much. I hope that wasn't like too much, but I hope it was fun.
It's just right.
If you'd like to learn more about this stuff, you're always invited to purchase my book on Patreon, which is available until the end of January. And then it will be deleted forever. It's going to be available until the end of January. And if you'd like to download these classes as a podcast, You can also do that on Patreon for $5 or $10. Most of all, we want to say thank you for joining us today.
Yes.
Thank you, Jenlene, for joining us.
My pleasure.
And we hope that you are well wherever you are in the world and that you have a wonderful rest of your week.
Yeah, we hope to see you next week. We hope you join us next week. And have a good week.
All right, guys. See you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.